Good evening. My name is Master Yao, and these are the Chronicles of Master Yao. Welcome back. I believe this is episode 11. And the last episode we spoke about the epigenetics of the black woman, the current state of the black woman, and what has been happening, what are the forces that has been shaping her social position, her worldview, her outlook on relationships, her outlook on politics, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we painted a somewhat bleak picture. And I don't think that people should be surprised, because this is a very harsh social environment to live in, this time and this environment. So we're not going to just leave you there. We're going to take a few more steps to show you what this means, and what are the solutions, and how can a man apply this to his life, to his personal life. If he takes a particular woman, how can he look at her and see what his relationship should be, what are the solutions, etc., 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 and what does he do? In other words, okay, we made these blanket generalized statements, so now let's take that and let's review what we talked about in the last episode and see, okay, how can we make a determination, is this group of women, or this one particular woman, where does she fit into this, and what do I do about that? Okay, so this is sort of a barometer of current women. That's kind of how we can put it. It's like a barometer. It's like taking a reading. So let's do a little review of episode number 10. So what did we say about the current nature of the modern black woman? Well, we talked about three things that are shaping and conditioning factors determining her gradual evolution from approximately 1900 till today. In other words, we're basically saying, let's go back 5, 6 generations and look at what's been shaping her till this current time. And then we came up with basically 3 things that we said defined her today, and that these things are part of her epigenetics. They're part of how she's born, that she's born with this, and that it can express itself or not, depending on what's happening in her life. So, the first thing that we said is that she has diminished feminine energy. And anyone who's read The House of the Woman and Awakening the Master Feminine understands what that means, that her feminine energy is not what it used to be, not what it needs to be, and it's harder for her to bring her houses of the woman, her archetypes of feminine energy, online. And the results of that are, the fact that she's sort of self-neutered herself over the last few generations and passed on these genes to her daughters. And we talked about the fact that this begins as an energetic thing. It spreads to psychology, and eventually it spreads to the physical body itself. And it's doing some hormonal things to her now, and it's also giving her a predisposition toward obesity. The second thing that we talked about that has occurred over these generations is that her overall worldview is feminist. And we talked about that this is part of the result of an abnormal psychology. That is a mental illness, that it is a condition of her psychology, her worldview, her way of seeing herself in the world that is abnormal. And so, when we talk about feminism and when we classify it as a mental illness, we're not talking about something that's just a trait of black women. No, it's a very popular trait in the entire world. And so we're talking about a geocentric way of looking at the world. In other words, it's something that says that because something is not where you are, it's wrong or it's inferior. So racially you would say, you know, I'm white, therefore I'm superior because everybody that's not white is not me, therefore you have to be less. That's a mental illness. It's saying, I'm Christian, therefore Islam is less, it's inferior, because it's not me. Which, you know, it's like, basically it's like saying hot is superior to cold because we're hot. And you're like, really? But that's the type of a mental illness that it is. It's looking at something and drawing a conclusion that basically makes no sense because you want to self-define without basing it on anything in real life. So the feminist thing is basically saying that females are superior to males, that they have an agenda that's superior to males because they're female and they're not male. And that's the basis of it. That is the psychology of it. Because when you try to find out why they consider themselves, their agenda as being more important than a male agenda, there is no logical reason for it. It's the same thing. You say, well, why are whites superior to Asians? And then when you try to explain that, you know, anybody with any sense can see that explanation doesn't cut. It doesn't cut. There's no scientific, there's no real science to support that. It's self-evident that that's false. But the person believing that strongly believes it. Why? Because they need to self-define. They have this need to self-define. Because they're starting out epigenetically, genetically, from a sub-position, from an inferior position, from an abnormal or not natural place in the beginning. And therefore comes this whole thing of trying to redefine the world to fit where I am. It's like saying the sun revolves around the earth because we need for the earth to be important because we're living on it. So the feminist worldview is a form of mental illness brought about by an epigenetic corrosion. And I'm sure I'll get a lot of pushback on that. But it's, you know, it is what it is. And this is partly why the black woman embraces the Black People brand, as we talked about back in episode, I believe, number 6. Now, you know, black men equally embrace Black People brand, but for the opposite reason. This is important to understand. We're not saying that black men don't do some of this foolishness. We're not saying that at all. We're not saying that white people don't do this. No, white people do it, but they do it differently. It comes out differently. And they do it for a very different reason, which is very important. And so basically because of this feminist worldview that she has inherited from her mothers, she embraces this false belief that black women are superior to black men. She won't come out and say that, but in all of the conclusions she comes to and the actions she feels are warranted are based on the fact that she feels she's superior to black men. It also manifests as a flawed female selection criteria because the psychology is flawed, the epigenetics are flawed, and how they are looking at men, how they're saying what I need as a mate, what I need as a, you know, as the attributes of a mate are no longer natural. It's based on a flawed premise to begin with. And so her female selection criteria for dating is as we said in episode, I believe, 7, I think it was, is flawed. It's completely out of kilter to anything natural. The third thing is the hardest to understand. So the black woman, because of this epigenetic predisposition, has lost her we identity. She has no group identity, or it's very, very weak. And she's left with only an I identity. In a normal human being that has a normal socialization and a normal evolution, they have some we, identification with the tribe, and some I, identification with self in the domestic family. And you know, you need this yin-yang balance to really be have a normal psychology, have a normal way that you look at the world. If you look at the world as completely we, then you've got like an insect brain, like a herd mind, which is not completely human. And so you have to do everything society tells you to do, right? The bees, and you have no way of really having an I-centric way of looking at the world, which can be very damaging. But the opposite is just as damaging. You have a lot of I, no we, and so you have a hard time supporting groups. You have a hard time identifying with the group you're a part of. You don't want to see yourself as a black person. You don't want to see yourself as an American. You don't want to even, associate with groups like religions and this, that, and the other. Not really, because you want to see everything as related to I and not we. And it's an abnormal human way of looking at stuff. So those are the three things that her epigenetic corrosion gives her a predisposition to express. A diminished feminine energy, a feminist worldview, and a worldview based or a behavior pattern based on I and not we. So we talked about that in the last episode, and these three conditions apply to all women, but not equally. Not equally at all. And so, yep, they apply to all women, for the most part, but they're not all have the same level of epigenetic corrosion. So we said darker skinned women tend to resist the damage more, and there's all kinds of other factors in there, of course, and so you could say, that's probably 3 or 4% of the women who are the most highly evolved women. And if you look at them, you can't see evidence of these three things at all, because they haven't expressed themselves, because something has happened in the way that they were brought up, or something has happened with their parents or with their environment or something, and they're just not expressing this epigenetic predisposition. And even there's the possibility that it's not there as much because their ancestors didn't experience the same level of stress, whatever, as other people. So you're going to see 3 or 4% of black women, and you're going to look at them and say, I don't see any of this stuff that Master Yah is talking about, because it's not there. But that's 3 or 4%, and that's not the majority. In the rest of the majority, you're going to see that about half of them, it's expressing itself and it's taking them over, and it dictates how they're going to act. And then in the other half of black women, they fought it. They've been able to, in spite of this epigenetic scenario, turn out good. And so as we ended our last episode, we said black men have to understand, they have to learn, they have to be able to see which is which in a specific woman or a specific group of women, which category they belong into. Okay. This is extremely important, and that's what we're going to start our discussion with tonight. So half or more of black women today are negatively impacted by the above conditionings and the above epigenetic dispositions that we talked about. And the other half don't. Somehow or another, they have fought. Their development was such that they were able to resist the disease, the virus, whatever you want to call it. They're still fighting. Their hearts are still trying to do the right thing, and their hearts are still pushing them to react and to live life as a normal woman. So this situation creates an imperative for black men. Number one, they must reject the toxic group of women. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. It's not a matter of, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to deal with them in a different way. I'm just going to only go in a little bit. No. You must reject, and in fact, you must isolate yourself from, and to the extent that you can, quarantine the toxic group of women. Because they infect any other woman around them, the more the woman opens up to that, and they will infect you. I mean, I tell men about this, and have been for the last 20 years, and it goes in one ear and out the other, because they see a nice shape, a nice pretty face, and they forget everything I told them, you know, until the hammer hits them, and then they're like, oh, I should have listened. So how do we do this? How do we determine which group is which women succumb, and which ones are toxic, and which ones are viable? The tool to use for this is what we call the counterfeit personality system. We talked about this in episode 2, the compass. We defined it in some detail, and of course it's in all of the books because it's just that important. How does he use the counterfeit personality system to determine if they're negatively expressing the epigenetics to such an extent that they're toxic, or they've overcome it and they have not? So there's two things that happen here. Number one, you look at the type of counterfeit personality, and we showed you the charts in previous episodes. I don't know if we're going to put that chart up in this episode or not. They probably will. But, so you got these 5 types of the counterfeit personality: the schizoid, oral, psychopathic, masochistic, and anal. And so in the schizoid, we're talking about masking phenomena. In the oral, we talked about the dependency phenomena. In the psychopathic, we talked about a control phenomena. In the masochistic, we talked about a passive, aggressive behavior pattern. And in the anal, we talked about this rigid, materialistic pattern of behavior, all of which are masking things, are disguises that people use so that you can't see their real personality, which, of course, is often dysfunctional, so they want to hide it. And the counterfeit personality is talking about how people are born with one personality, but to try to cope with life, they develop an alternate one, a counterfeit personality. So there is a coping mechanism that's central to each of these personality structures. For schizoid, they have to intellectualize stuff. For oral, they have this entitlement thing. For psychopathic, they're argumentative. That's the way that they cope with people. They constantly argue with them to throw them off and to get their way. Masochistic, they're constantly rebelling against policies or structure or the social framework itself. In the anal, you know, they're masochistic, and the anal, they're materialistic. In other words, they deal with materialism only. They won't deal with emotions. That's their disguise. And so then they have what we call a compulsion. That is the next step after you get past the coping mechanisms. And so for the schizoid, it's criticizing. For the oral, it's consumption. For the psychopathic, it's control. For the masochistic, it's interfering. And for the anal, they must win. And what you have to look for is when these drives become obsessive, when they don't seem to be able to control them anymore, it's like they have to do it. I've got to criticize you every time you talk, whether you're right or wrong. I've got to consume. I'm gambling. I'm eating. I've got to consume sex. I've got to constantly be in a state of consumption of something. It's obsessive. Control. I absolutely have to be in control to the point where it impedes me from making money, having friends, and doing my job and whatever. When they get to this obsessive level of the thing that is the key point in their counterfeit personality type, they have reached the chronic phase, and they are no longer viable. They're toxic. That's one way of telling. The second way is the level of the counterfeit personality. So, there's 5 levels of grades of each counterfeit personality structure. There's the mild, acute, chronic, severe, and then there's the necromancy, where it's pretty bad. So here's how you can tell if one of the counterfeit personality structures, if that person has reached a chronic phase, which is the red flag point, is which that person is toxic. So they're only aroused by negative things. In other words, something good happens, they don't pay much attention to that. They don't get excited about that. And they soon forget it. But let something negative happen, no matter how tiny, they get all excited and they focus on that. And that alone. They're only aroused by negative things. That's a sign of chronic toxicity. They're only able to function in reptile brain mode. Now, I'm not going to get into a big discussion of that. We talked about that in an earlier episode. The 7 layers of the brain, and the reptile brain is the most primitive. And you know how reptiles operate in nature and relationships. They don't really give a darn about relationships. So, if you see a person operating in that reptile brain all the time, chronic personality structure. If the woman belongs to one of these 3 groups that we're going to define later, the apology woman, the acculturated prostitute, we're going to define her, the Amazon woman. If she's in any of these 3 prime groups, she's reached a chronic level, red flag. If you see a woman who only responds to external factors that have nothing to do with her, she responds to the media, to celebrities, to her female peers, whatnot. She ignores men, and she ignores her man and her family completely. She just, it's like a boom. I'm listening to this, my friend that I know for 6 months who doesn't have any level of expertise, but I won't listen to anybody that's male, even though that person is an expert. That person has reached a chronic level. They can no longer function. They can no longer, they're driven by something that's not logical. If a clinical psychotherapist defines that person, that woman, as narcissistic, bipolar, borderline personality, or sociopathic, they have reached a chronic level, obviously. And the final thing is the easiest to see. If the woman has reached a point where she is non-orgasmic from vaginal penetration or clitoral stimulation, and she can only reach orgasm through masturbation, she is chronic. I'll say that again. If the woman has reached a point where she is non-orgasmic through regular means, and she can only experience orgasm through masturbation, she is definitely chronic in her counterfeit personality structure. And so what we're saying is, if she gets to that chronic phase, she's in that 50 percentile, that's toxic, not viable. You have to let it go until you learn how to deal with it, which is the subject of a later episode. So the remainder of this discussion is going to be devoted to women who are toxic. So everything that we say after this point does not apply to the 50% or less of women who are viable, who are not expressing their epigenetic predispositions toward dysfunction. They've done something to fix themselves, they had good role models, good parents, whatever they've done, they're still viable, they're still in the game, they're still fighting, their hearts are still good. So we're not talking about those women anymore. Everything we said before now applied to them, and everything that we're saying after this does not apply to them. It only is applying to toxic women. So we talked about these, how you can tell. Well, so now after you learn how to tell her, now here's what you can predict she's going to do. So now what we're saying is, okay, you identified her as a toxic woman. How is she going to behave? What is she going to do? And what do you have to protect yourself from? Here's what she's going to do, and here's what she's always going to do consistently. She has a complete lack of accountability. She will not be held accountable for anything that she does wrong. Ever. Not by a man. she promotes form over function. We talked about this in a previous episode, where they want things that look good and that are shiny and bright and that appear good, that have a good facade, that give you the promise of something, but there's no functionality. They resist dealing with stuff that's functional. They only want the form, the facade, the surface. That's it. Nothing else. Number 3, they are governed by the black people brand. So remember, we said before, there's a group that really doesn't deal with it that much, and there's a group that lives by the black people brand. So now we're defining which that group is. So the chronic people, the women who are toxic, they live by the black people brand. It's a negative brand. So if you do something that's outside of the black people brand, they will, they will chop your head off. They will immediately condemn you. And so if a celebrity is cheating, whatever, oh my God, he should be fired, But the white person can do the same thing. They don't have nothing to say. Black people brand is, that's a tough piece right there. And the 4th thing is that everywhere they go, everything that they do, one of their goals is dissension. They live in a pool of dissension. They live in a sea of dissension. They thrive off of dissension, and they seek to create dissension between men and women every day of their life. And every time you see them come into an environment and leave, they leave dissension behind. They not only can't navigate their own relationships, but they screw up everybody else's. They are purveyors of, that's what they trade in, dissension. Those 4 things, when you see these toxic women, you know what they're going to do, so you need to be prepared. If your best friend if your girlfriend's best friend is toxic, you know she's going to do those 4 things. She's going to create dissension every chance she gets. So be prepared. She's not going to be accountable for nothing. So be prepared. She's always going to choose form, the way things look, the way things appear on the outer surface, and she's going to reject things that function. So when you come up with stuff that works, a business, a relationship, an institution, a society, a club, she's going to reject that. And she's always going to choose the form over it. A pretty boy is better, superior in her mind, to a man who's going to be true, do his thing, and take care of you, this, that, and the other. And so she gets involved with these guys who are form, and they have no function. And then when it doesn't work, she finds somebody else to blame for it. They're governed by the black people brand. So they're going to do this all the time, without fail. Be prepared. Understand that this is going to happen. Don't let it catch you by surprise. And by the way, all 4 of these things that the toxic women do are symptoms of negative water culture that we talked about in episodes 8 and 9. And of course, negative water culture has its roots in religious dogma and sexual suppression. You start to see how this whole science comes together, how all of these episodes now are going to start to connect, and we're going to start to see that we're reaching certain conclusions about stuff. We're going to talk about black men. We're going to talk about society. We're going to talk about racism. We're going to talk about all kinds of things, cycles, this, that, and the other. And you're going to start to see that this is all one big ball coming together with branches going off and interconnections here and there. We're going to decode the matrix. In all cases involving toxic black women, it's impossible to communicate with them. Why? They won't respond to reason, and they always redirect blame because they're not accountable. So no matter what happens, you can't communicate, you can't achieve anything, because anytime something goes wrong, they redirect the blame back to the black man. They're never going to hold the thing that's accountable for it accountable. So you never get to the root of the problem. You can't ever get them to fix anything because they never will take accountability. They're always going to say it's that person's fault. It's never my fault, or if it's not their fault, if it's the car's fault or the society's fault or the Congress's fault, they're never going to point to them. They're always going to point back to the black man because of their feminist agenda. And so you have this situation where you can't ever fix stuff with them. You can't ever solve problems with them. You can't ever compromise with them because they're constantly redirecting so they can never see what's really wrong in their environment. And they go through life just failure after failure, all kinds of crazy stuff happening to them because they can never see, they refuse to see what's really wrong in their life. And you can't convince them otherwise. And, you know, until you get into another whole space, then, you know, it's a hopeless situation to try to communicate with them. They just can't do it. They're not capable of it. And unfortunately, the more a woman perceives herself as being sexually attractive, the worse this situation is. The more she expresses these 4 toxic traits that we talked about above. So if you get on a scale of 1 to 10, it's the 6s, 7s, 8s, and 9s that are the most invested in this stuff in terms of lack of accountability. You know, their motto is be a bitch. Don't be accountable. I mean, when you talk about form versus function, the more attractive a black woman is, the less and less and less she gives any concern to stuff that functions. They don't care. On the outside, such women are gorgeous. I mean, they pay excessive attention to makeup and what they're dressed with, their cars and, you know, styles and facades, and everything is form with them. They're obsessed with, you know, with how they look because they're obsessed with form. They don't care nothing about function. And so, I mean, it's very enticing to a man to be taken in by these women. I mean, that's not saying that the viable women aren't also attractive. There's some 7s and 8s and 9s and 10s there as well, an equal amount. So you got attractive viable women, attractive toxic women. You got to tell which is which. But the toxic attractive women are the most invested in the form over function piece, where you try to deal with them in something, business or otherwise, there is no functionality there. There is no functionality there. They are the golden calf that, you know, it's an idol that people want to carry the golden calf around during the celebration, but it's got no use for nothing. It's got no use. Inside they're hollow. And their female selection criteria is a testament to this. 2/3 of all men are in the non-select category. And oftentimes, these are the men with the best husband qualities and the best father qualities. So their families are dysfunctional because there's no form. I mean, there's only form. There's no functionality in the men that they choose and the family situation, the domestic structure that they set up. Men who deal with such women are courting disaster and are constantly today experiencing that disaster. And some of them, they're in a pattern where every woman they deal with is more and more dysfunctional, and they seem to have an appetite for it and can't get enough. I mean, because women in general, the functional, the viable and the toxic, are more susceptible to the media, social trends, their peers, and outside influence of being influenced. Men are not. Men are resistant to outside influence. They are influenced by the outside, but it's much harder to influence men in the same way that women are influenced. And so men can discriminate about it. And so if you're with a viable woman, you can work with her because she'll listen and she'll learn and she understands the value of function. You're with a toxic woman? No, not going to do it. 50% or more of black women are toxic to men in relationships. Now let's get to these three subcategories that they fit in. So let's become a little bit more specific in how to tell them when you see them. One group is called the apologetic black woman. One group is called the acculturated prostitute. One group is called the Amazon woman. And I talk about these groups in all of the books. Especially, there's case studies and everything in the book called the Marmor, the first book. Let's give you just a little bit of, enough so that you can know what you're looking at. So what is the apologetic black woman? You know her. She might be your sister, your cousin, your teacher. These are the women who see themselves as members of a marginalized group. They see themselves as being disadvantaged. Thus, they are in a constant apology to whites, seeking to reclaim inclusion. So they've been pushed out, and they're constantly apologizing, begging to get back into the group. They've been pushed out of the clubhouse, and they're constantly knocking on the door. Can I please get back into the clubhouse, please, Mr. Bill? And, and this whole herd mentality thing that they got. So their goal is respectability. And they try to get to this respectability goal by self-policing. Who do they police? They police black men. They don't police themselves. So they encourage black men to uplift themselves, their social values, their financial standards, to their life, so that they are compatible to mainstream values, white values. And that is their driving force. That's their driving force. That's the reason that they're in relationships. It's got nothing to do with you, black man. They believe that if the black man is humble, respectable, and meets white standards, then the inclusion of the black race will ensue. In other words, the only reason whites enslave blacks and treat them so bad and oppress blacks is because blacks are not respectable, humble, and making enough money, which is beyond ridiculous. These women are heavily invested in religion, and they are looking at religion as the savior, as what they're going to use to uplift these men to get back into the good graces of white people. And they have not, because of their epigenetic baseline, they have not evolved past the herd brain, the insect brain, the herd mentality. They haven't gotten to the mammal brain and the human brain yet. They're still in that insect brain circuitry where they feel like they've got to be included in the main group, or, whatever. And, so they don't look at religion as a way of getting closer to God. No. Religion is a way of them shaping the people around them in their family, and especially men, so that these people will get to a place where, we can have a better life now, because white people now will include us. And that's the largest group of black women, of toxic black women. But it's not the most toxic group, not by a long shot. The next group is the acculturated prostitute, and they've got the apologetic black woman beat in terms of toxicity. So the acculturated prostitute, stated concisely, she values the dollar over the relationship. Didn't surprise you, did I? She is distinctly adversarial to the black man. You're like a con to her, basically. You're a contest. And, she's the primary enforcer of the female selection criteria. That's so important to her. And she doesn't care about the fact that what she does has such a negative impact on black men. That's not a concern, because as a feminist, she believes women are superior to men. Her pain is greater than your pain. Her success will do more for the race than your success, etc., etc., etc. She has zero accountability. Her worldview is geocentric to the fact that her status is superior to yours and anybody else's. She is form versus function. She's not a common prostitute, no. She's far more dangerous. She looks respectable perhaps, but there is a definite connection between her intimacy and her intimate partner and her receipt of material goods and services. Now, you know, at the extreme level, she's what you call, you know, a gold digger. But there's many levels beneath that. And they're no less damaging to the black man because they destroy the trust. And when that man gets out of that relationship all broken and busted up and goes to the next woman, the trust is gone, and the next woman has got a hard time trying to, you know, repair that. She's engaging men in situations where they have sexual desire for her, but she doesn't have the sexual desire for them, nowhere near that level, and she plays that. You know, that's like a quantifiable tool that she uses to get an advantage over you. The last one is the most toxic, the Amazon woman. She's more toxic than the acculturated prostitute. The Amazon woman, by definition, will say her feminine yin energy is weak, her yang masculine energy is very strong. Here are the main identifying traits in her behavior. She is very difficult to satisfy and not easily impressed. You know, you can, you know, win the Olympics, hit the lottery, and build your own house by hand, and she's not impressed. The Amazon woman only becomes passionate about negative things. She's way beyond the other women in that regard. She's like, positivity can be happening all around her, and it depresses her. She's happy. She's energized when everything is negative. And she likes nothing better than finding fault with a man and just hammering that in every conversation she gets in. She cannot and will not accept criticism or judgment or advice from a black male. Can't do it, won't do it. She strongly resents male authority figures, strongly resents it. No matter how right they are, how whatever, she just resents male authority figures. And she has a lot of trouble in bed. So basically what you find is that she has a lot of trouble being satisfied by a man sexually. And so, you know, her energy literally causes erectile dysfunction if the man is around her long enough, and other problems. Now, she may not look masculine. Some of them look very feminine. But once you get her in bed or in a situation where you have to deal with her intimately or personally or in business, you see the Amazon traits very clearly. And of course, lesbian women are the extreme version of that. But most Amazon women are not lesbians. They are not. They are heterosexual. They deal with men. They just don't deal with them in a very feminine type of a way. And men, men with weak masculine energy, you know, often gravitate around these types of women, and much to their dismay later. And in all three categories, the Amazon woman, the acculturated prostitute, or the apologetic woman, you know, it's a different category of the same thing. They're all toxic. And we categorize it so that you can tell when you see it. You can see the characteristics and know what category to put them in. But we're all talking about the same thing, a negative counterfeit personality structure that's chronic. Now, men do indeed have their faults, and we're going to spend the whole episode talking about that. I know everybody's looking forward to that. But before we even get to the male faults, one of the biggest male faults is he can't recognize, or he refuses to recognize, a toxic woman when he sees one. Even before you listen to this video, before you read my books, or before somebody else has explained the problem to you, we have this issue where black men act like they can't see, act like they don't have common sense. They see that the woman is got some issues. But because she looks good, she looks sexy, and the toxic woman is going to go to great lengths to do that, as we have said, they take chances anyway. It's like, yeah, I can see that she's dysfunctional as heck, but hey, I'm gonna go in there and try it anyway. And you know, then they get them pregnant, or they get into these deeply emotional relationships where all this drama ensues. They burn their house down or some mess, and then they're like, you know, black women this and black women that, and they start dating white women. But you, black man, it's your fault. You could have saw it. All you got to do is open your eyes and pay attention. And now I've given you the blueprint with all of this information. If you're still choosing toxic women, I can't help you. Shame on you. You deserve the drama she's going to give you. Stop it. You know, even without toxic black women, you got enough problems in life with all of the other stuff out here. The economy, the this, the that, the father not being, all this other stuff. You're underneath the 8-ball. You're underneath the gun. The chances are against you making it if the woman is fully supporting you. And you're going to go out here and find one of these toxic, foolish women to deal with. Brother. Don't do it. Be smart. I saw this issue unfolding as early as 1990, all of this stuff we're talking about. And so I came up with solutions to all of it. I've been talking about it for 27 years. So everything that I've talked about, it may sound, it's the end of the world. No. There's solutions to all of it. But the first thing you got to do is stop dealing with toxic women and find you a viable woman. There's plenty of them out here. You just don't want to do it. You got to do it if you're going to pull up out of this tailspin that you're in. My name is Master Yao. I don't always say what you want. But it's out of love. I hope you'll continue following these chronicles. Wakanda forever.